Hi, welcome to this month's Patreon Q&A, and this month we only have one question, so I'm going to jump straight over to it. Peter Stebbing asks, you're just about to start an IM campaign. IM means Imperium Maledictum, the new 40k, Warhammer 40k RPG. Similarly, I'm going to be running the Enemy Within, with the PCs as investigators belonging to a made-up organization. How do you run investigative campaigns well? I replied, ooh, that's a meaty question, and Peter followed it up with lots of stuff out there on GMing individual adventures, the three clue rule, etc., and some good stuff on setting up the campaign, the conspiramid, etc., but not much else. Okay, and there was a follow-on comment also from him, which is apologies if it's not going to be investigative. There will be investigative elements in it. So let's talk about this a little bit, and from my perspective, well, I guess the first thing to say is that I've never run an investigative campaign before. I've run investigative scenarios, like pre-published scenarios, like one-shots or 2 or 3 shots. And I've also helped put together, well, that's not quite true. For Stiletto, we have a demo adventure, which I didn't write. Paul, our like scenario and setting guy, he wrote the adventure. But I did have some feedback, or not. I did have some kind of input into it and some feedback for it to kind of help shape it to how it is. Although I don't want to take too much credit for it. And one of those was to include lots of clues, etc. But that taps into some of the common advice for investigative adventures, because that is meant to be a one-shot, although in reality it's a 2 or 3 shot. And yeah, I don't have any experience running a big campaign, big investigative campaign. So, but the plan for me with I'm going to call it Necromunda, because Imperium Maledictum is the rule set, but we're going to be playing on the planet of Necromunda, and I'm kind of referred to it as a Necromunda game. And there's going to be 2 players in it, and they are going to be effectively investigators working for the Guilders. So they're going to be going down into the lower hive and investigating things. So it is going to be a campaign. It's going to be a relatively short campaign, about 12 sessions probably altogether, roughly, of about 2 to 2.5 hours each. So it's not going to be this long epic thing like the Masks of Nyarlathotep. Oh god, I can never say the word. Masks. Or Horror on the Orient Express or anything like that. But it is going to definitely have investigative elements. So what I'm planning to do is I'm planning on actually building a sandbox, first of all, so that the players have agency. They can go around, they can check out different things. But they need to have some direction to help them go into the right, to make sure that they're investigating the right things, they know where to look. So I am actually going to be using a lot of advice from the 3 Clue Rule article written by Justin Alexander on the Alexandrian blog post, which is an excellent blog post. If any of you haven't read it, it's definitely worth reading. In fact, I'm going to show it here quickly on the screen because I have it open. Here it is. There'll be a link in the description below, so you can find it as well. But basically, this was written in 2008, so it's pretty old now, but it's still the kind of gold standard for advice on running investigative adventures. And I think a lot of this can apply to a campaign as well. So if we just kind of scroll down, the core of it is this bit here. For any conclusion you want the PCs to make, include at least 3 clues. And that's basically it. So you want them to kind of go from one place to another, or there's something they need to figure out. Make sure there are 3 different types of clues that they can find so that they're able to find it. And you kind of want to disperse these around the area. You might want to have clues linking to clues. I mean, it can become quite clue driven in terms of like coming up with lots of different clues. But the way I find it, in my own setup, the way I find of doing this is to do my usual sandbox prep, and then I have so there's something they're investigating, there's something that's gone wrong. I can't say too much about this because I don't want either of my players to discover it, and I don't want to spoil the surprise for people who might watch the campaign. But ultimately, the way I do it is there is something happening that they have to investigate. They have to figure out what's going wrong. And the way I like to do it is I like to come up with first what is the actual problem. So in a way, I'm coming up with a meta plot, if you will, for the campaign. I then like to have potentially, I like to keep it a little bit ambiguous, or that there's a little bit, it's not very straightforward. And I can't say too much more about it without giving a lot away. But basically, that end result isn't necessarily something set in stone. There could be more than one factor at play with it. And that gives me multiple tangents for coming in to solving or to figuring out what's going on. And basically, you just work your way back from there. So you talked about the conspirament as well, Peter, and that's also another really interesting technique to be thinking about. If you have, and in fact, the conspirament is perfect for a campaign. It's not necessarily just for an adventure. It's a really great way to set up a hierarchy of villainy, if you will, but you can also use it as a way of modeling out your clues and think of, you've got your ultimate thing that's trying to be investigated at the top, and then you could have like 3 branches for each of them. I mean, it'd be a really messy pyramid very quickly, because for each segment you'd have 3 things. But that's effectively what it is. You could do a mind map or something like that as well. I've kind of done a messy mind map on like scrap paper. I'm planning on porting all of that into a digital tool to kind of help move things around and edit things, because it's just a little bit more neat. But it's something I'm still working on. And from my perspective, this is the thing that I'm really working with. I am working with a 3-clue rule. I've talked about it before on when I was on the Mud and Blood podcast. We talked about it a lot. It's a really powerful investigative tool, and it's really, really good. So it's something I would definitely recommend. And if you read the article a bit further down in terms of like extending it, etc., there are these corollaries which are quite good. And some of them specifically I want to touch on, for example, red herrings. Players will latch onto red herrings. They will run off on a tangent with them, and it can be kind of fun from a GM's perspective, but they can also be really frustrating from a player's perspective when they find out this thing that they've been chasing, they've been certain about this thing, isn't actually, it's a red herring. And I think they can be quite effective, but if you're going to use a red herring, I think at the end, the red herring should have a little clue to help them get back on track, so it wasn't all for nothing. Although it shouldn't be too, if it's too big of a clue, then it's not a red herring at all. It's just a very convoluted clue path, if you will. There's also this thing I wanted to talk about as well here in this corollary called Nothing is Foolproof. It links to an essay by Ben Robbins. Ben Robbins is a guy who wrote Microscope and Kingdom, which are both excellent sort of mini games, if you will, for... anyway, I won't go off on too much of a tangent. But the really good thing here, that's really good advice, is to come up with revelations. And the revelations as examples are: normal weapons can't kill the zombies, Microman doesn't trust Captain Fury, the lake monster is really Old Man Wiggins in a rubber mask, these sorts of things. So there's revelations that when the players discover what they are, it's kind of like a light bulb moment, and it in itself acts as a very big clue to help direct their efforts going forward. And basically, Justin recommends, rather than restating this, just to go read that article. There's a link in here. I won't include the link. Go down, read this bit that Justin's written, then follow the link. The essay by Ben Robbins is really good. But the little bit that Justin recommends here is to write the revelations out. So to basically prep these revelations as you're preparing the investigation. And I think this can work really well for a campaign. Although, bear in mind that I'm effectively running a long scenario. We're going to be running a scenario that's going to be 12 sessions long, if you will. It's almost like the first arc of a long campaign. So you can almost use this advice for scenario design in a short campaign. So I'm kind of cheating with answering your question here, because in my own experience, these are the sorts of campaigns I run these days. I don't run really, really epic long campaigns. And when I have run epic long campaigns, the last one was a long time ago with my home group, and it definitely was not investigative. It was, I think it was Mutant Year Zero off the top of my head. But even when we ran, the group originally were doing Dungeons and Dragons, that we never did investigation in that, or if we did, it was a very minor thing. So I don't have a lot of experience with this. I have my experience with like Call of Cthulhu and the Cthulhu-esque games really is scenario driven and not long epic campaigns. So I might be the wrong person to ask, but this is how I'm planning on doing it. I'm planning on using the sandbox campaign tools I've talked about in the past. I've written a little bit about it in Year Zero Mini, for example. I've talked about it on the Mud and Blood podcast quite a bit, and I'm planning on then having, as I said before, this meta plot, this event that they're meant to be investigating, as with the reason behind it as the main thing, and then I'm basically planning backwards from there. And what that does is it gives me a lot of freedom in populating locations, populating NPCs into my sandbox that are directly related to the investigation. But I can also expand that and include lots of other NPCs and locations like I normally would. What I think is important with an investigation is that you have to be kind of careful here, because I think it's important that most locations or people that they're going to visit are relevant to the adventure, relevant to the campaign. Otherwise, they become red herrings in their own right, or they become a way for players to basically lose interest in your investigation and start looking at something else. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to make it too railroady. So there's kind of a balance to be had here, and I think the way around this is that in my example, I can kind of tell you what the main thing is that's going on, or what they're investigating. The guilders are going to be working for the Corpse Guild, and essentially the quotas for the Corpse Guild are not being met. They're getting very close to the red line where there's not going to be enough corpse starch to feed the population of this hive. And they're naturally concerned about this, because if that happens, there's going to be famine, there's probably going to be riots, things are not going to be good. So there's these two player characters are being sent down to kind of look into what's going on and figure out what's going on. So I know what's happening. I know why there is a shortage of corpses. My players have to figure that out. But because this is quite a big thing, especially in the hive, the Corpse Guild are going to have these like enclaves all over the place, because a hive is massive, and these Corpse Guilds are responsible for collecting corpses and for reducing the corpses down into corpse starch. And they're going to be on edge because they're not getting the corpses that they need. The people are going to be aware of this generally. They already fear the Corpse Guild. So there's going to be a lot of I think as soon as a player characters start kind of investigating, it's likely that the general population are going to know who they are, or at least who they're working for, and that's going to affect things. They're either going to be scared of them, or they're going to be desperate to stay on their good side, because you do not want to be on the bad side of the Corpse Guild. Or if they're involved somehow, they might be hostile. It just really depends on how I plan on building this out. But the point is, the plot is pretty all-encompassing. It's going to have its tendrils into most parts of the setting, so I can really infuse the plot, this meta plot, into what's going on. And I think that's important, because that keeps them from, them focusing on a throwaway NPC or a location or a small minor side plot that ends up like taking all their attention. And while I know my players these two players specifically are pretty good, they're GMs themselves, they're going to be on the ball with following the plot. It's still kind of one of these things that you want to kind of plan to make sure that they're interested in, and make sure that it's kind of something that holds their attention and keeps them focused on it without it being too railroady, feeling too railroady. And I think that's the whole point of the 3-clue rule, is to have an investigation that doesn't feel railroady. Investigations are one of the most railroady types of adventures you can have, because you need the players, generally speaking, or traditionally speaking, you need the players to get from point A, the start of the scenario, to point B, which is the climax of the scenario, finding out what the mystery was all about and confronting the mystery. And to get from A to B, I mean, you got to follow the clues, and the clues generally are laid out in a path, and they might branch off in a few points, but they're going to come back to the main thing at the end. So it definitely can feel very much like a railroad. And in a sandbox, which is by design not meant to be railroady, you're kind of you're kind of designing for two different things, right? You're designing for a sandbox, but then you're also designing for an investigation. And yeah, they're kind of they don't traditionally work super well together. But I think it can be done. And in fact, if you look at something like Masks, which is a massive campaign set all over the world, and it's an investigative campaign, that is basically you're finding out what's going on, and you have to find these revelations one at a time, and you do that by going to different areas, and that's what you're doing. So that's something you could do with a bigger campaign than what I'm doing. Is you could treat the revelations as mini arcs within themselves, which are part of the investigation. Maybe that's what they're investigating first, is these revelation points. I'm using the example of the lake monster is really Old Man Wiggins in a rubber mask. Well, they're investigating the lake monster in that case. But maybe the bigger mystery is, why is Old Man Wiggins doing that? And that leads to the next mystery, or potentially another revelation. And if you handle it like that, I think that's an easier way to handle, looking at Masks as inspiration. Masks has all these different places around the world that you can go investigate to figure out what's going on, and eventually will lead you to the climax. And I think that's the way to do it. I don't, unfortunately, have any experience with this myself. And I think probably Liam over on Toa Tabletop, which used to be the Mud of Blood podcast, he is prepping to run Masks. And he has also been involved in lots of long investigative campaigns. So he would be a good person to ask for advice on this. Other than that, I don't know how much more I have to say about it. I am planning on doing some of my GM prep as videos and releasing them on YouTube. So I will be talking about this, and how there will be very spoiler heavy, because I'll be talking about, things like plot, but mainly talking about like the campaign setup and stuff. But I appreciate, like, if you're running the enemy within, and depending on the chapter that you're running of it, or the part of it that you're running, it kind of is spread all over the empire. So it's very much it can be very much a sandbox if you wanted it to be. Whereas, mine is also like a hive city in 40K is huge and sprawling, and in all likelihood, I mean, if you count all the different levels, is probably just as much area to cover as the empire in Warhammer's Old World. But it's more constrained. You can keep things more constrained to certain places, certain levels are off limits, etc. Although, the Drakwild in the Old World is also relatively off limits. I don't know. There's similarities, there's differences. I think from my perspective, a single city is a bit easier to plan a sandbox around than an entire country, if you will, or empire in this case. So it just really depends, I think. It depends on what exactly you're planning to do with your campaign, because you talk about you're running the enemy within, which isn't really a sandboxy campaign. Although you haven't mentioned sandbox, I'm mentioning sandbox. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of interesting. I'd like to talk to you about this more, maybe on Discord, in terms of what your plans are for tying the enemy within to this investigative campaign, because that sounds like two different campaign concepts. I imagine that the enemy within is kind of something running in the background a bit, or you're treating the plot elements. This is probably more likely. You're treating the plot elements from the enemy within as sandbox, like pulling them apart and using them more individually or modular, so that you can kind of treat the whole thing as a bit more of a wider campaign. But this is all the advice I have. You've hit on a lot of the stuff that I would normally recommend, and I have recommended in the past. And I think from my perspective, even if you're not running a sandbox campaign, there's a lot to be gleaned from a sandbox for any campaign, because sandbox campaigns are player driven. They are super high with player agency. They're a lot easier on the GM to prep. Well, up front, there's a lot of prep, but once it gets started, the prep is relatively easy. And they kind of run themselves to a certain point. And I think that's the real beauty of treating campaigns as a sandbox, even if they're not necessarily a sandbox, is the players will feel this level of freedom. They'll feel like there's a lot of agency. They'll feel more involved in the story rather than just being bystanders who are kind of listening and have a minor role to play, if you know what I mean, in a greater story that's happening. So definitely a lot to kind of take away from sandbox, various sandbox advice that kind of exists around the internet. or in various role-playing books. Another thing which you could do is you could look at games that set up investigative campaigns. So you could look at, for example, Blade Runner, if you have it from Free League, which has a city. In fact, I'm probably need to have to talk about this. I should probably look at Blade Runner and the advice for setting up case files, because it talks about case files, and case files are solving a mystery, and it's not intended to be done in a single session, or even though the case files are kind of scenario driven, they're meant to be taking place over a number of sessions. And I think that's probably a great place to look as well for some advice. Also, I know you're familiar with Tales from the Loop. Tales from the Loop has some really great advice for mysteries and kind of how to, I mean, it's pretty basic, but it's still, there's still some really good stuff there for putting that together. But I think Blade Runner might be a really good one because it is kind of sandboxing, that it's based in a city. And you are, at least from my perspective, it's probably more, it might have more relevance to me in my Necromunda campaign than it would be for you in your Enemy Within campaign. But something like that might be a good source of to look at for some advice. But that's me. I'm going to stop there because I think I've probably talked this subject to death, and I don't really have much more to add. So thanks very much, Peter, for your question. And to anyone else who has watched this and is interested in asking questions, my Q&As are a Patreon benefit. So if you do want to get me to answer a question like this, where I'll spend time talking through rather than just giving you, a couple of sentences on social media somewhere, you've got to be a Patreon. And there's a link in my description to the Patreon. In fact, there's a link here to my Patreon page as well. And yeah, I got lots of other benefits going up there too. So take a look at it if you're interested, if you like the channel, if you like what I'm doing, and you'd like to show me some support. Otherwise, that's me. Catch you next time. Catch you next month. And yeah, take care. Bye-bye.